My name is Clara, and I never wanted a fortune. I fell in love with a man, a kind, gentle widower named Frank Blackwood, whose heart was far more valuable than any stock portfolio. But to his adult children, Tom and Lisa, I was never a person. I was a line item in their inheritance, a walking, talking threat to be neutralized. They spent 5 years trying to tear our happiness apart with thinly veiled insults and constant whispers of my supposed greed. They never imagined that their final, most public attack would cost them everything, not through a lengthy legal battle, but with a few strokes of a fountain pen on a simple cloth napkin, wielded by the very man they had pushed too far. When I met Frank at a charity auction, he was a man adrift in the quiet sea of grief, having lost his wife of 40 years, Alina, 2 years prior. I was a librarian, a woman who had built a small, contented life surrounded by books and the quiet dignity of my work. We connected not over his wealth, but over a shared love for historical biographies and a similar, dry sense of humor. Our courtship was a gentle, unhurried affair, two people in the autumn of their lives discovering an unexpected spring. He was brilliant and generous, and for the first time in a long time I felt truly seen. I was not naive. I knew that marrying a man of Frank's considerable means would come with complications. His children, both in their late 40s, were already circling the family fortune like well-dressed vultures. My first meeting with them was a masterclass in passive aggression. It took place at the sprawling Blackwood estate, a magnificent old house that felt more like a museum than a home. Tom, a slick investment banker with his father's height, but none of his warmth, shook my hand with a grip that was more of an assessment. Lisa, who had inherited her mother's society-perfect features, offered a smile that never reached her cold, calculating eyes. They asked me questions about my life, my career, my family, but it wasn't a conversation. It was an interrogation, a subtle but clear attempt to find the cracks in my story, to expose me as the social climbing opportunist they had already decided I was. Throughout lunch, they peppered their conversation with loving anecdotes about their mother, Alina, each story a carefully aimed dart designed to remind me that I was an outsider, an imposter sitting in a dead woman's chair. I understood their grief, or at least I tried to. I knew that my presence was a stark reminder of their loss. I vowed to be patient, to be kind, and to earn their trust, believing that in time they would see the genuine love I had for their father. I was wrong. My patience was not a virtue to them, it was a strategy. My kindness was not genuine, it was a tactic. In their eyes, I was playing a long game, and they were determined to ensure I lost. The 5 years following our wedding were a slow, grinding campaign of psychological warfare. Tom and Lisa's initial coldness festered into a barely concealed contempt. Their hostility was rarely overt enough for Frank to call them out on directly. Instead, it was a constant stream of microaggressions, 1,000 tiny cuts designed to bleed me of my confidence and joy. Family gatherings became exercises in endurance. Lisa would accidentally omit my name from the place settings at holiday dinners, forcing an awkward shuffle as Frank insisted a spot be made for me. When family photographs were taken, Tom would orchestrate the arrangement so that I was always on the very edge, easily cropped out of the final print that would hang on the wall. He once even quipped, "Let's get one with just the original family, for old time's sake," a comment that made the air so thick with tension you could barely breathe. Their favorite weapon was the constant allusion to my modest background. They spoke of my life before Frank as if it were a Dickensian tragedy from which he had rescued me. "It must be so overwhelming for you, Clara," Lisa once said at a garden party, her voice dripping with faux sympathy as she gestured to the lavish surroundings. "To go from, well, all of that to all of this." They spoke of their inheritance as if it were already a settled fact, a tangible object I was trying to snatch from their grasp. Conversations with Frank would often be steered towards estate planning and the importance of preserving Alina's legacy. The subtext was always the same: ensure the money stays where it belongs with them. I tried everything. I remembered their birthdays, celebrated their professional achievements, and showed genuine interest in their children, my step-grandchildren. But every effort was met with suspicion. If I bought them a gift, it was because I was trying to buy their affection. If I offered to help with an event, it was because I was trying to usurp their mother's role as the family matriarch. The gold digger label, though often unspoken, hung in the air at Ev. Interaction. They would make comments in front of Frank, thinly veiled jabs designed to poison his mind against me. "Dad seems to be spending a lot on redecorating," Tom would say, his eyes flicking to a new piece of art I had picked out. "You've got to be careful, Dad. A fool and his money are soon parted, especially when there are so many new expenses." Frank, for his part, was not blind to their behavior. He was a deeply patient man who loved his children, and he was caught in an agonizing position. He would defend me, gently at first, then with increasing frustration. "Clara is my wife, and she is a part of this family," he would tell them, his voice tight. "She has brought more happiness to this house than it has seen in years, and I will not have you disrespect her." But his admonishments only seemed to harden their resolve. They saw his love for me not as a genuine emotion, but as a sign of his senility, of my manipulative power over him. They believed they weren't just protecting their inheritance. They were protecting their father from his own foolish heart and from the cunning woman who had captured it. The tension was becoming a corrosive force, eating away at the peace Frank and I had worked so hard to build. I knew something had to give. I just never imagined it would happen in such a spectacular, public, and ultimately devastating fashion. The source of Tom and Lisa's poisonous behavior, I came to believe, was rooted in a complex cocktail of grief, entitlement, and the long shadow cast by their mother. Eleanor Blackwood had been a formidable woman, a society queen from old money who had managed her family and her social standing with an iron will. From the stories Frank told, she was a loving mother, but also a woman who firmly believed in the sanctity of bloodlines and the importance of legacy. Frank's fortune was not just money, it was the Blackwood legacy, and Eleanor had raised her children to see themselves as its sole, rightful custodians. In their minds, I was not just a new wife, I was a hostile takeover. I was a foreign entity attempting to merge with a family corporation they were destined to inherit. They were protecting their birthright, and in their grief-addled view, they were also protecting their mother's memory. I once found an old photo album in the library, filled with pictures of Eleanor. In every shot, she was immaculate, poised, surrounded by the trappings of wealth she wore so effortlessly. Lisa looked so much like her it was startling. I realized then that Lisa wasn't just competing with me, she was competing with a ghost, trying to fill the impossibly large shoes of a mother she idolized. Anything I did to make the house my own, rearranging furniture, planting new flowers in the garden, was seen as an erasure of Eleanor, an insult to her memory. Their entitlement was a product of their upbringing. They had never known a life without immense privilege. The family fortune was a constant, immutable presence in their lives, a safety net that had allowed them to take risks, to live comfortably, and to see themselves as a class apart. Tom's banking career, while successful, was built on the foundation of his father's connections and seed money. Lisa's life as a philanthropist was funded entirely by a generous trust fund. They had never had to truly struggle, and so they could not comprehend a life like mine, where success was measured by a balanced checkbook and a sense of personal fulfillment, not by the size of a portfolio. Their obsession with the inheritance was not just about greed, though that was certainly a powerful component. It was about identity. Being the Blackwood heirs was who they were. The thought of any part of that identity being redirected to me, a former librarian with no pedigree to speak of, was an existential threat. It upended the entire narrative of their lives, the story they had been told since birth. They believed they were acting out of a sense of duty, a righteous defense of their family's sacred order. This understanding, however, did not make their cruelty any easier to bear. It simply framed it in the more tragic light of a battle they were fighting against a phantom, with me as the unfortunate collateral damage. They were so blinded by their past that they couldn't see the present, and they were about to sacrifice their entire future on the altar of a legacy they had completely misunderstood. Frank's legacy was never just about the money. It was about integrity, love, and generosity, qualities they had long since abandoned in their frantic effort to protect it. Frank was a man of immense patience, but he was no fool. He saw every slight, heard every backhanded compliment, and felt the chill in the room every time his children entered. For years, he played the role of peacemaker, hoping that time and my unwavering kindness would eventually erode the walls they had built around their hearts. He bore their disrespect with a quiet, sad dignity, but I could see the toll it was taking on him. I would see him after a tense phone call with Tom, his jaw clenched, his eyes filled with a deep paternal disappointment. "They're still grieving, Clara," he would say, more to convince himself than me. "They just can't see past their own pain." But as the years wore on, his excuses for them grew thinner. He began to see their behavior not just as a product of grief, but as a deep-seated flaw in their character. The turning point for him, I believe, came about a year before his 75th birthday. We were planning a trip to Italy, a place he and I had both dreamed of visiting. He casually mentioned it to Lisa on a call, and her reaction was immediate and telling. "Italy? That's a rather extravagant trip, isn't it, Dad?" she had said, her voice laced with a false concern that was her specialty. "At your age, you should be thinking about preserving your capital, not squandering it on romantic getaways. You need to think about the future of the estate." The call ended, and Frank was silent for a long time. He stood by the window overlooking the gardens, his shoulders slumped. "She's not worried about my health or my happiness," he said, his voice heavy with a dawning, painful realization. "She's worried about the money. She's tracking my spending like an accountant, worried I'm spending her inheritance." It was a heartbreaking moment. He saw, perhaps for the first time, that his children's love had become conditional, that their concern was not for him, but for his assets. From that day on, something in Frank shifted. His patience began to wear thin. He stopped trying to reason with them and began to simply shut down their manipulative conversations. When Tom would start in on a lecture about fiscal responsibility, Frank would cut him off. "My finances are my own concern, Tom. And I would appreciate it if you would treat my wife with the respect she deserves." End of discussion. These moments of firmness were small victories, but they did little to change the overall dynamic. Tom and Lisa simply recalibrated their approach, becoming more subtle in their attacks, framing their greed as loving concern. Frank's frustration grew, simmering beneath his calm exterior. He was a man who had built an empire through shrewd negotiation and decisive action, yet in his own family, he felt powerless, trapped between his love for his children and his love for his wife. He was being forced to choose, and the choice was becoming clearer and more painful with each passing day. The man they saw as a doddering old fool, easily manipulated by his new wife, was quietly reaching his breaking point. They had underestimated his mind, his resolve, and most of all, his profound love for me. They had spent years chipping away at his patience, never realizing that they were also chipping away at their own future. The planning for Frank's 75th birthday was fraught with a familiar low-grade tension. I wanted the celebration to be a bridge, a grand gesture of family unity. I envisioned a warm, intimate affair that would honor Frank and just maybe signal a truce in our long, cold war. I was, as always, overly optimistic. I first suggested a party at the house, a place where Frank was most comfortable. Lisa immediately vetoed the idea. "A party at home is far too much stress for Dad," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "And besides, organizing something of that scale is, well, it's a very specific skill set, Clara. Mother was a master at it." The implication was clear. I was not. She insisted on a formal dinner at Le Cille, a stuffy, Michelin-starred restaurant known more for its intimidating wine list than its atmosphere. It was Aline's favorite restaurant, a choice I knew was deliberate, another way to make me feel like an outsider on what should have been a joyous occasion. I acquiesced, deciding it was a battle not worth fighting. My attempts to collaborate with her on the guest list were met with similar resistance. The list she and Tom compiled was heavy on their own business associates and society friends, with many of Frank's and my closest companions relegated to a maybe list. "I need to ensure the right people are there, Clara," Tom explained, as if planning a corporate merger. "It's about maintaining the family's image." I put my foot down on that point. I insisted that Frank's oldest and dearest friends, particularly Mark and Evelyn Davies, be included. Mark and Evelyn were not just friends. They were both accomplished lawyers who had known Frank for over 40 years. They had been kind and welcoming to me from the very beginning, and I knew Frank would want them there. After a brief, sigh-filled argument, Lisa reluctantly agreed. In the week leading up to the dinner, the atmosphere at home was thick with a sense of impending doom. Tom and Lisa called constantly, not to discuss happy birthday wishes, but to micromanage the arrangements, their conversati. Ons with Frank invariably circling back to their favorite topic, the estate. Frank grew increasingly quiet and withdrawn, his usual good humor replaced by a weary resignation. He felt like a prop in his own celebration, a guest of honor whose actual desires were secondary to his children's agenda. On the morning of his birthday, I gave him my gift, a first edition of Churchill's Memoirs, a book he had been searching for years. His eyes lit up with genuine delight, a spark of the man I loved shining through the gloom. "You see me, Clara," he said, his voice thick with emotion as he squeezed my hand. "You always see me." As we dressed for the dinner that evening, I felt a knot of dread in my stomach. I chose a simple, elegant navy dress, determined not to give them any ammunition for their gold digger narrative. Frank looked distinguished in his favorite tailored suit. But as he adjusted his tie in the mirror, his reflection looked tired and old. "Let's just get through this, my love," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. I knew then that my dream of a unifying celebration was a foolish fantasy. We were not walking into a party. We were walking onto a battlefield. Lucille was exactly as I had pictured it, a temple of hushed, opulent dining. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and truffle oil. A string quartet played softly in a corner, their music a delicate, crystalline layer over the low murmur of polite conversation. Our party was seated at a long, rectangular table in a private alcove, draped in white linen and glittering with an arsenal of silverware. Tom and Lisa were already there, holding court, their backs to the entrance. They greeted us with air kisses and tight, performative smiles. The guests, a mix of their society friends and our true companions, mingled awkwardly. I could feel the invisible line dividing the room, our friends on one side, theirs on the other. I took my seat next to Frank, with our friends Mark and Evelyn across from us. Evelyn gave me a warm, reassuring smile, a small gesture of solidarity in a sea of chilly politeness. The first hour of the dinner passed in a carefully orchestrated charade of civility. The food was exquisite, the wine was sublime, but the conversation was strained and superficial. Tom held forth on the stock market, while Lisa recounted a recent charity committee meeting with an air of profound importance. They directed most of their conversation to their own friends, treating me with a polite but pointed indifference. They asked me no questions, did not engage with my attempts at conversation, and when they looked at me, their eyes were as blank and cold as porcelain. Frank, for his part, was a gracious host, but I could see the effort it cost him. He engaged with his friends, told a few charming stories, but his smiles didn't quite reach his eyes. He seemed to be observing the evening from a great distance, a sad spectator at his own life's event. The tension at the table was a palpable thing, a low hum of resentment just beneath the surface of the clinking glasses and forced laughter. I could feel the eyes of Tom and Lisa's friends on me, their gazes filled with a curiosity that felt more like judgment. They were sizing me up, the librarian who had somehow landed the Blackwood fortune. I felt like an exhibit, the controversial centerpiece of an evening that was supposedly in Frank's honor. As the main course was cleared, I knew the moment for the toasts was approaching. I felt a fresh wave of anxiety. I had prepared a few heartfelt words, a simple tribute to the wonderful man I loved. But I knew that before I could speak, Tom, as the son, would have the floor. I braced myself, expecting another passive-aggressive performance, another veiled insult wrapped in the guise of a loving tribute. I had no idea that they had decided, on this night of all nights, to finally dispense with the veil. They were ready for a public execution, and I was the one they had placed in the stocks. The clinking of a spoon against a crystal glass cut through the low hum of conversation. Tom rose to his feet, a smirk playing on his lips. He held his champagne flute aloft, a gesture that was less celebratory and more predatory. The table fell silent, all eyes turning to him. Frank looked at his son with a weary, almost pleading expression, as if hoping just this once for a moment of genuine connection. "I'd like to propose a toast," Tom began, his voice smooth and confident. He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the table before it landed with deliberate, theatrical precision on me. "To my father, Frank Blackwood, a man who has built an empire through shrewd acquisitions. He has always had an eye for value, for assets that appreciate over time." He smiled, a cold, humorless expression. "Here's to Dad and to his latest and most expensive acquisition." The silence that followed was immediate and profound. It was a vacuum of sound, a sudden, oppressive hush that sucked all the air out of the room. The insult was so brazen, so stunningly cruel that for a moment no one knew how to react. I felt the blood drain from my face, a hot flush of shame and humiliation spreading across my chest. It felt as if he had physically slapped me. Before the guests could even process Tom's words, Lisa, her face alight with malicious glee, chimed in. She raised her glass to meet her brother's. "Here, here," she chirped, her voice light and musical. "Let's just hope this one comes with a good return policy." A few of their sycophantic friends let out nervous, tittering laughs, but the sound died quickly in the thick, horrified silence. Mark and Evelyn Davies stared at Tom and Lisa with expressions of pure, unadulterated disgust. My own friends looked at me with deep concern. I kept my eyes fixed on the tablecloth, unable to meet anyone's gaze, my hands trembling in my lap. And then there was Frank. I chanced a look at him. The weariness in his eyes was gone. The sadness was gone. It had been replaced by something I had never seen before in all the years I had known him. A stillness. A cold, absolute calm that was far more terrifying than any rage. The patient, gentle man I loved had vanished, and in his place was the formidable businessman who had built an empire, the man who knew exactly how to handle a hostile takeover. He did not raise his voice. He did not cause a scene. He simply, and with chilling deliberation, snapped. The years of quiet frustration, of patient endurance, of heartbreaking disappointment in his children, had finally coalesced into a single, unalterable point of action. He had been pushed for the last time. Frank's movements were slow, measured, and utterly captivating. Every person at the table was frozen, their attention fixed on him as if he were the only person in the world. He did not look at Tom or Lisa. He did not acknowledge their vile performance. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and produced a beautiful, old-fashioned fountain pen, a gift I had given him the previous Christmas. The quiet click as he unscrewed the cap was the only sound in the cavernous silence. With his other hand, he reached for the thick, starched cloth napkin that lay beside his plate. He spread it out on the table in front of him, smoothing the creases with a calm, deliberate motion. The white expanse of linen looked like a blank declaration of war. He then turned his head slightly and looked directly at Mark and Evelyn Davies, his lawyer friends who sat across from him. He didn't speak a word, but his gaze was clear and commanding. He was putting them on notice. He was about to do something significant, and he wanted his legal counsel to bear witness. "In light of my children's disgusting and unforgivable behavior, here, tonight, in front of you all," he announced, his voice low but carrying with absolute authority to every corner of the alcove, "I am making a formal and binding codicil to my last will and testament." A collective gasp went through the guests. Tom and Lisa stared at their father, their smug expressions dissolving into a mixture of confusion and dawning panic. They had expected tears or a quiet retreat from me. They had expected a weak, ineffectual protest from their father. They had never, in their wildest dreams, anticipated this. This was not in their script. Frank lowered the nib of the pen to the napkin. The scratch of metal on fabric was unnervingly loud in the silent room. He began to write, his elegant script flowing across the linen. He did not hesitate or falter. The words came to him as if he had been rehearsing them for years. He spoke aloud as he wrote, his voice a cold, clear monotone, a judge delivering a final, unappealable sentence. "I, Franklin James Blackwood, being of sound mind and body, do hereby amend my will. My son, Thomas Aliner Blackwood, and my daughter, Lisa Marie Blackwood, for their demonstrated lack of love, respect, and basic human decency, are to be removed as primary beneficiaries of my estate." Tom made a choked, sputtering sound, half rising from his seat. "Dad, what are you doing? This is insane. You can't be serious." Frank didn't even look up. He simply raised a single finger, silencing his son with a gesture of pure, unshakable authority. He continued writing and speaking. "They shall inherit one asset, and one asset only, the family home on Willow Creek Lane, and all of the extensive mortgage debt still attached to it." Lisa let out a small, horrified whimper. The house they claimed to cherish as their mother's legacy was, in reality, a massive financial liability, a beautiful, crumbling money pit they had always expected the estate to maintain for them. Frank paused, dipping the pen in a small, portable inkwell he carried, a deliberate, theatrical gesture that stretched the tension to a breaking point. Then he delivered the final, devastating blow. "All other assets included. My entire investment portfolio, all properties, all liquid assets, and soul, irrevocable control of the Blackwood family trust, are to be placed under the exclusive management and benefit of my beloved wife, Clara Blackwood. She and she alone will be the steward of my legacy. He underlined my name twice. The room was utterly breathless. He had not just disinherited his children. He had handed the keys to their entire world, the world they believed was their birthright, to the one person they despised more than anyone. Having finished writing, Frank placed the pen deliberately on the table. The napkin lay before him, a stark document of revolution. He scanned the words one last time, his expression unreadable, then signed his name with a flourish at the bottom. The signature was firm and clear, the mark of a man utterly certain of his actions. Then he looked up, his gaze once again finding Mark and Evelyn. "Mark, Evelyn," he said, his voice calm and direct. "You have been my friends for 40 years. You are both officers of the court. You have just witnessed me create this holographic codicil in a moment of absolute clarity, prompted by the vile behavior you have also just witnessed. I ask you now, in your capacity as friends and as legal professionals, to sign this document as witnesses." Mark and Evelyn exchanged a long, significant look. I could see the professional conflict in Mark's eyes, the instinct to advise his client against such a dramatic, emotional decision. But I also saw the human understanding. They had been front-row spectators to the years of Tom and Lisa's cruelty. They had seen my quiet endurance and Frank's growing pain. This was not a rash decision born of a fleeting moment of anger. It was the eruption of a volcano that had been dormant for far too long. Evelyn was the first to move. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Mark took a deep breath, his expression shifting from one of shock to one of grim resolve. He stood up, walked around the table to Frank, and took the pen. "Of course, Frank," he said, his voice low and serious. He read the napkin carefully, his lawyer's eyes scanning the text for any ambiguity. Then he signed his name below Frank S., adding the date and the words "witnessed by." Evelyn followed, her signature just as firm, her face a mask of solemn support. The act was done. The informal had been made formal. The emotional outburst had been notarized by the presence of the law itself. A simple cloth napkin had just become one of a handful of the most important legal documents in the Blackwood family history. Frank took the napkin, folded it once with precise, sharp creases, and slid it across the polished mahogany table. It glided over the surface and came to a stop directly in front of me. I stared at it, this simple piece of linen that now represented a seismic shift in all of our lives. It was a declaration of love and trust for me, a verdict of condemnation for them, and a source of immense, terrifying power. Then, Frank leaned back in his chair, a long, slow exhalation of breath leaving his lips. He looked at his children, truly looked at them for the first time since the toast. Their faces were ashen, their eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief, horror, and a dawning, frantic greed. He gave them a small, cold, utterly mirthless smile. "Happy birthday to me," he said, his voice quiet but echoing with the finality of a slamming iron door. The carefully constructed world of Tom and Lisa Blackwood had just been reduced to ashes, and they were left staring at the smoldering remains. The immediate aftermath was pure chaos. The quiet, refined atmosphere of Lucille was shattered as if a bomb had gone off. For a moment, Tom and Lisa were frozen in stunned silence, staring at the folded napkin on the table as if it were a venomous snake. Then the shock curdled into pure, unadulterated rage. Tom was the first to break. He lunged across the table, his face contorted in a mask of fury, his hand reaching for the napkin. "You can't do this," he bellowed, his voice cracking. "This is a joke, a sick, twisted joke." Mark, anticipating the move, was faster. He intercepted Tom's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Don't be a fool, Tom," Mark said, his voice a low, dangerous warning. "Assault and attempting to destroy a legal document will not help your case." Lisa, meanwhile, dissolved into hysterical sobs. "Daddy, no," she wailed, the sound high-pitched and theatrical. "How could you? After everything Mother wanted, after everything we've done to protect you from her." She pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at me. I recoiled as if struck. Even now, in the face of their own self-inflicted ruin, they still saw me as the villain. The other guests were a mixture of horrified and mesmerized. Tom and Lisa's friends looked on aghast, their faces pale. Our friends, however, looked on with a kind of grim vindication. The private drama they had been privy to for years as now playing out in public, and the oppressors were finally facing the consequences. The restaurant's manager, a small, nervous man in a tuxedo, hurried over, his face a mask of professional panic. "Is everything all right here, Mr. Blackwood?" he whispered, his eyes darting between the weeping Lisa and the furious Tom. Frank looked at the manager with an icy calm. "Everything is perfectly fine," he said, his voice dripping with irony. "My children were just leaving." He then turned to Tom and Lisa, his expression devoid of any warmth or pity. "Get out," he said, the words as sharp and cold as shards of glass. "You have embarrassed me, you have humiliated my wife, and you have disgraced the family name in this public place. Get out of my sight. Now." For a moment I thought Tom might actually strike his father, but something in Frank's eyes, a look of absolute finality, stopped him. Defeated, he slumped back into his chair, his face a mottled red. Lisa's sobs subsided into angry, hiccuping gasps. The game was over, and they had lost in the most spectacular way possible. Frank stood up and gently took my hand. His touch was warm and steady. "Clara, my love," he said, his voice now soft and filled with a profound sadness. "Let's go home." He nodded to Mark and Evelyn. "Thank you, my friends." Without another glance at his devastated children, we walked away from the table, leaving them sitting amidst the ruins of their own making. The car ride home was shrouded in a thick, heavy silence. Frank stared out the window, the city lights reflecting in his eyes, but I knew he wasn't seeing them. He looked older than I had ever seen him, the weight of his 75 years and the painful act he had just committed, pressing down on him. There was no triumph in his posture, only a deep, bone-wearying sorrow. He had won the battle for me, for our life together, but in doing so, he had lost his children. The victory was profound, but the cost was immeasurable. The next morning, the house felt unnervingly quiet, charged with the unspoken emotions of the previous night. I found Frank in his study, sitting in his leather armchair, the infamous napkin spread out on the desk before him. He hadn't slept. The air was thick with the smell of old books and fresh grief. He looked up as I entered, and the sadness in his eyes was so profound it made my heart ache. "Was I too harsh, Clara?" he asked, his voice raspy. "To do that to my own children?" I sat on the ottoman at his feet and took his hand. "You were pushed into a corner, Frank. They gave you no other choice. This wasn't one night, this was 5 years of cruelty. They humiliated you and me in front of our dearest friends. You simply reacted. You protected me, you protected us." He nodded slowly, but his expression was still troubled. "The napkin," he said, gesturing to it. "It was a statement, a necessary one, but now we need to make it ironclad." He picked up the phone and called Mark. The conversation was brief and to the point. An emergency appointment was made for that afternoon. We met Mark at his downtown law office, a space of quiet, somber professionalism. He treated us with a gentle gravity, his demeanor that of a doctor about to deliver a serious diagnosis. He had the napkin, now safely enclosed in a plastic sheath, on his conference table. "Legally speaking," Mark began, "this is a holographic codicil. It was written entirely in your hand, it's signed, and it was witnessed by 2 credible parties. In this state, it is a very strong legal document. It clearly states your intent. However," he paused, looking at Frank with serious eyes, "you must expect the legal challenge of a lifetime. Tom and Lisa will contest this with everything they have. They will claim undue influence on Clara's part. They will claim you were not of sound mind, that you were acting out of emotional distress. It will be long, it will be expensive, and it will be ugly." Frank listened, his face set like stone. "I am of perfectly sound mind, Mark, and the only undue influence at that table was my children's greed. I want you to draw up a new, formal will, one that reflects the terms on this napkin, but in language so precise and so absolute that it will be unbreakable. I want you to include a psychiatric evaluation from my doctor, dated for today. I want notarized statements from you and Evelyn about what you witnessed last night and in the years prior. We will build a fortress around this decision." Mark nodded, a look of grim admiration on his face. "It will be a fortress, Frank, but they will still lay siege to it. Are you prepared for that war?" Frank looked at me, his eyes softening. "I am prepared to do whatever it takes to ensure my wife is safe, respected, and secure. And to ensure that my legacy is in the hands of someone who understands its true value is not in money, but in character." The decision was no longer just an angry reaction on a napkin. It was being forged into an unassailable the legal reality. The war had just begun, but Frank was already reinforcing his defenses, preparing for the inevitable, brutal assault from his own flesh and blood. the expected counterattack was not long in coming. 2 days after the disastrous birthday dinner, Tom and Lisa appeared at our front door. They hadn't called. They simply arrived, their faces a mixture of desperation and defiance. I saw their car pull up the long driveway and my stomach clenched. Frank, however, was calm. "Let them in, Clara," he said. "This is a conversation that must be had." I opened the door. They brushed past me without a word, their eyes fixed on their father, who was waiting for them in the grand foyer. They looked terrible. Tom's usually immaculate suit was rumpled and his eyes were bloodshot. Lisa's face was pale and tear-streaked, her usual poised elegance completely gone. They looked like what they were, two people whose entire world had been pulled out from under them. Lisa tried tears first. "Daddy," she began, her voice trembling. "We are so sorry. We don't know what we were thinking. It was a stupid, horrible joke. We were just emotional. Please, you can't do this to us, to the family. Think of Mother." Frank's expression did not soften. "I have thought of your mother, Lisa," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And I know she would be ashamed of what you have become. You have used her memory as a weapon for years. You will not use it now to excuse your own venom." Tom, seeing that pleading was failing, switched to threats. "You know this won't stand up in court, Dad. We've already spoken to a lawyer. They'll say he jerked his head in my direction, manipulated you. That you're an old man who isn't thinking clearly. We will drag her name through the mud. We will drag the entire family's reputation through the mud. Is that what you want?" "What I want," Frank replied, his voice rising for the first time, a deep, powerful anger breaking through his calm, "is for my wife to be treated with a shred of the decency she has shown you for 5 years. What I want is for my children to see me as their father, not as their personal bank account. You speak of reputation. You, who would publicly humiliate me and my wife at my own birthday celebration. You have no standing to speak of reputation." The confrontation was raw and ugly, a toxic release of years of resentment. They begged, they threatened, they accused. They offered insincere, self-serving apologies. Through it all, I stood by the staircase, a silent witness to the complete and utter collapse of a family. Frank was immovable. He listened to their tirades, his face a mask of profound, sorrowful resolution. Finally, he held up a hand. "Enough," he said. "This is over. The decision is made. The new will is being drawn up as we speak. You have what I have allotted you. Now I am asking you for the last time to leave my home." The finality in his voice was absolute. There was no room for negotiation. Lisa let out a strangled sob and fled the house. Tom gave his father one last look, his eyes filled with a venomous hatred that chilled me to the bone. "You will regret this," he spat, before turning and following his sister. As the front door slammed shut, the sound echoing through the cavernous house, Frank finally let his composure break. He sagged against the wall, the strength seeming to drain out of him. He looked at me, and his eyes were filled with tears. "I have lost my children, Clara," he whispered, his voice cracking. In that moment, he was not a titan of industry or a powerful patriarch. He was just a father grieving a loss that was as profound and final as any death. I went to him and held him, my own heart breaking for his. We had won. Our future was secure. But the cost was a gaping wound in his heart, a wound I knew would never truly heal. In the months that followed, our lives were transformed. The legal battle began, just as Mark had predicted. Tom and Lisa filed a lawsuit to contest the will, and their lawyers began a campaign of depositions and discovery designed to harass and intimidate. They dredged up every detail of my past, painting me as a conniving predator who had targeted a vulnerable, grieving old man. But Frank had prepared for this. Our legal team, led by Mark, was a fortress. They had Frank's psychiatric evaluation, notarized witness statements, and years of financial records that showed Frank was in complete control of his faculties. The children's own history of taking enormous sums of money from their father over the years was used against them, reframing their concern as a long-standing pattern of financial entitlement. The house, once a battleground of passive aggression, became our sanctuary. With the toxic presence of Tom and Lisa gone, a sense of peace settled over the estate. Frank and I began to truly make it our own. We filled it with art we both loved, hosted small, intimate dinner parties for our real fry. NDS, and spent our evenings reading in the library, the quiet companionship a soothing balm on our wounded hearts. Our relationship, forged in the crucible of this family conflict, became stronger than ever. We were a team, united against the storm. But the storm still raged outside our walls. The legal fight was a constant, draining presence in our lives, and beneath Frank's resolute exterior, I knew his grief for his children was a constant, dull ache. He never spoke their names, but sometimes I would find him staring at an old family photograph, his expression filled with a complex mixture of love and loss. He was mourning the children he had raised, not the greedy, bitter adults they had become. I, too, was changed. The immense responsibility that now lay on my shoulders was daunting. I began working closely with Frank and his financial advisors, learning the intricacies of the portfolio and the trust I was now destined to manage. It was a world I had never asked to be a part of, but I was determined to honor Frank's faith in me. I would be the steward he believed me to be, one who valued integrity and purpose over sheer profit. My victory was not the triumphant moment of a gold digger who had hit the jackpot. It was a solemn, heavy responsibility, a sacred trust born from a moment of profound family tragedy. We had found peace, but it was a quiet, walled-in peace, forever tinged with the sadness of what had been broken to achieve it. Justice had been done, respect had been won, but the family was shattered, and no amount of money could ever piece it back together. A year after that fateful birthday, the legal battle reached its crescendo. A judge, after reviewing the mountain of evidence Frank's team had compiled and listening to the increasingly desperate and contradictory testimony from Tom and Lisa, dismissed their case. The ruling was a scathing indictment of their motives, citing their clear and demonstrable history of financial avarice and emotional cruelty towards their father. The napkin codicil and the subsequent formalized will were upheld in their entirety. The war was officially over. The news was delivered by Mark in a calm, professional phone call. When Frank hung up, he didn't cheer. He simply nodded, a quiet finality settling over him. That evening, he opened a bottle of wine he had been saving, a vintage from the year we were married. We sat on the terrace, watching the sun set over the gardens we had replanted together. "It's done," he said, his voice quiet. "They're gone, and we're here." The silence that followed wasn't heavy with sadness, but with a kind of peaceful, reflective melancholy. The pain of the schism would always be a part of our story, a scar on our family's history. But scars are a sign of healing, a testament to a wound that has been survived. Frank had made a choice not just to protect me, but to protect the very values he had built his life on. His children had confused the fortune with the legacy. The fortune was stocks and bonds, properties and accounts. The legacy was integrity, love, and the courage to stand up for what is right, no matter the personal cost. In his final, most difficult act as a father, he had tried to teach them the difference. Whether they would ever learn that lesson was no longer his burden to bear. I took on my role as the steward of the Blackwood Trust with a seriousness of purpose that surprised even myself. Guided by Frank's wisdom, I began to shift the trust's focus towards philanthropy that was meaningful to us both. Literacy programs, in a nod to my old life, and medical research for the disease that had taken his first wife, Eleanor. I was determined to make the Blackwood fortune a force for good, to create a new legacy of compassion and purpose. Our life together was quiet, but it was rich and full of a deep, abiding love. We had weathered the storm. The price had been steep, leaving a permanent ache in Frank's heart. But it was the price of peace, the cost of respect. We had built a new life from the wreckage, a life of our own choosing, defined not by the bitterness of the past, but by the quiet, resilient love that had seen us through it all. And in the end, that was a fortune greater than any inheritance.